during the Mugabe regime back in Zimbabwe, and in 2007 she was arrested and beaten pretty bad and tortured, and when she went through this, she was in her 60s. Mrs. Holland's connection to Australia was throughout the Aboriginal rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and she was one of the leaders or allies that helped to establish the community control organisation Marawina, which was a children's organisation in Redfern in Sydney. So she's had a lot to do with human rights and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocacy throughout this history. And being a politician and being captured, I guess, and tortured during her 60s, I found that a really hard story to hear, because being a grandmother now, but I thought about my grandmother at the time. So she was in her 60s and she had grandchildren and things like that. And when she spoke about peace, and she spoke about forgiveness and a life after violence. And that has helped me to shape how I think about things, that there is a life after violence. And the women that I spoke to, and the families of the women that I spoke to who have been murdered, the women, the survivors themselves, they all spoke about life after violence. And so, yeah, I need to make sure that I pay my respect to Mrs. Holland, because she was a thought provoker in this this concept I've titled Infrastructure of Violence. Yeah. So when I start talking about violence and the Indigenous woman, we have to understand that there's been this corpus of knowledge created about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and the corpus of knowledge that we've come to know in Indigenous women. And these are often binaries that are juxtaposed or in comparison or opposition with or to the white woman. And here I talk about the ideal victim, which I will go into a little bit detail. But these conceptualizations aren't our own conceptualizations. And these definitions that have become known about Indigenous women are definitions created by other people. So as an Aboriginal woman, a survivor of violence who has grown up on an Aboriginal mission, who left school in year 11, went on to do a PhD and had a child at a young age, these sorts of stereotypes often perpetrate certain ideas about who we are as women. And it's these inscriptions that inform the definitions and the languages that are often associated with these definitions, and particularly the historic conceptualizations and the impact that has and that carries over in the current day. And then we also see the systems and the structures, policies and responses that are also often impacted by these inscriptions and definitions about who we are as Aboriginal women. So I hope this doesn't trigger anyone, this slide in particular, but it goes to the heart of where these colonial and historical inscriptions have informed the way in which Aboriginal women have been positioned. And Prof. Aileen Moreton-Robinson's book talks about that in great depth. So I'm informed by her work, but also informed by Professor Nakata in the way in which language is used to inscribe these descriptions about Aboriginal women. I've used a quote there that was written by a guy by the name of Charles Priest, and he was perceived to be somewhat of an ally. And you can see here his statement, raping an Aboriginal woman was a common enough fact of life in those days that it was not likely to have the traumatic effect on her as it would in the case of a white woman. So these are the historical and colonial constructs that have been written about Aboriginal women and the way in which we've experienced trauma and violence, but also these descriptions about how we do not connect with that part of trauma, which is actually nonsensical. And then these ideas were also reinforced through the writings of the day. And as you can see on the right, April 1920, there was a poem and like literary works, as well as, you know, the works of the government reports of the day would often use things like labels like lubra and gin, and black velvet in particular was or is still in where I come from, down in New South Wales, is still a common phrasing around sex with Aboriginal women. So these are the historical and colonial inscriptions that have been described about Aboriginal women, particularly in relation to sexualisation. So when we come forward to the almost current day, there and victimology, or and the research that understanding or unpacking victimology, we've got Niels Christie's concept of what the ideal victim looks like. And this work is back from 1986, if I remember correctly. And the ideal victim is blameless, weak, sick, old, or very young, carrying out a respectable project. So walking in a park, walking home from work, those types of things. And the offender is big and bad, and the offender is often a stranger. And as we'll see in the next few slides, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women don't kind of fit this conceptualisation. So when I started looking at this idea of the ideal victim, and I looked at this because I've actually had women say to me that police have said they're not actually the ideal victim. So they didn't come in with a bruise, and they didn't come in sober, and they didn't come in with all of these ideas around what an ideal victim is. And you can see from Madrid's typology of the female victim, you've got on the left side the innocent victim and the culpable victim. And it's here we start to see this tension, because Indigenous women don't necessarily fit these categories and these definitions. And particularly when we start to unpack the statistical framings and how Aboriginal women experience violence and those sorts of things. So you can see the respectable woman. She's a dubious reputation. She was attacked while she was engaged in a respectable activity. She was attacked while engaged in an activity considered improper. So it's this toing and froing of language that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women get caught up in, and kind of don't fit these narratives and these definitions. And this is something that a recent statistical report, and you can see in the abstract in this report that, next slide. And you can see in this abstract that, you know, Indigenous women are likely to know their attackers, or the people that perpetrate violence against them. So 97% of the homicides of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women over a 34-year period, 97% were killed by someone they knew, and only 2% were by strangers. So when we come back to those ideas about the ideal victim, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience violence in very different ways, and also the responses and the systems that respond to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are based on these definitions and these historical understandings. And I bring us back to the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women haven't defined who they are in this themselves. So, and the precursors leading up to the homicides in this report were arguments where jealousy was part of the disagreement, but also the use of alcohol and drugs. So if we go back to the culpable victim, we go back to Niels Christie and Madrid's typology, we can see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women may not fit these categories. So what do we do? Where do we go? And and yeah, next one. Yeah, that one. So, and then, so we have to understand the linguistics that are associated this, which I call a linguistic entanglement, but maybe someone else has come up with an idea or something, but it's like an entanglement for me. It's like, where do Aboriginal women and Torres Strait Islander women, where do we, it's not that we want to fit in these ideologies or anything, but when it comes to responses and shaping responses, how do we respond to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women if these perceptions and these historical constructions have been created to basically to segregate Aboriginal women from seeking support that they need. So yeah, it's this language that I kind of get caught up in and trying to understand, where did all of this stuff come from? So I'm still in very much in the thinking stage. And then Madrid's research, they talk about the use of the word survivor, and survivor being reductionist as well. So if we can't use victim and we can't use survivor, how do we define ourselves, or how are we thought of in that regard? And what I really want to make and bring home is that growing up with a very strong Aboriginal family, I've always known our family to be powerful and having agency. And yes, we have experienced violence, but the women in my family have demonstrated that there's life after violence. So these socially constructed narratives have a very, what Prof. Sana talks about, a very material consequence in the current day. And this comes back to the way in which Indigenous women are framed, and where all this stuff comes from, the historical writings, the literature, media, and then how the government has picked up this idea of safe communities, that our communities are unsafe, and those sorts of things. And one thing I would like to bring your attention to is the work of Prof. Martin Nakata, where he talks about islanders living in their own present. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women live in these situations, they live in violence. And quite often they may make choices that they have to stay in the violence because that is the safest place for them at that moment in time. And we need to be able to be ready to operationalise a support process if they need to get out quickly. So they're not passive groups of people. They're not accepting of the violence. They don't tolerate the violence, and they're not complicit because they're actually making decisions. And part of this decision is them enacting their agency, because at that time, in that moment in time, that's the safest place for them to be, because once they start talking about leaving, they might raise the issue about separating. They might actually attempt to separate, and then there could be all family law matters and things like that. That's when we start to see the escalation of violence. And it's at that point that it's more dangerous for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children to leave violence. So coming back to some of the interviews that I've done, where you see an asterisk above a name, that's a woman that I've given a pseudonym from my research. And you can see here about when we start to talk about women's voices and the erasure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women as humans, and the way in which we're perceived and constructed in society by the media, by white people, and how we're supposed to behave. These are really really deep conversations that I had with the women who were very articulate in bringing their ideas across about how they're perceived in community, and also how they're perceived in white society. And as you can see here, if you don't fit a box, you're either angry or you're hostile, or you've got some type of attitude problem. Again, coming back to that ideal victim. What is an ideal victim? What is an ideal survivor? You know, those sorts of things. It's the construction and how we're seen in society. So if you're not submissive, so when you think back to Madrid's statement, if you're strong, And I've only known strong Aboriginal women. I haven't known anyone who fits the criteria of a white woman. I don't know what it's like to be a white woman. So that construction is foreign to me. So these are the things that the women were sharing with me in the interviews. And coming back again to the ideal victim, and this is where I say, you know, this entanglement, this linguistic entanglement of who is a victim and who is a survivor. And as you can see here, Kira says, I'm a survivor and my children are survivors. So she's actually naming herself in that. She's not a victim, you know, and people were trying to force her to fit the victim narrative. And as you can see, she says, I'm not a fucking victim. You know, she's a single mom, 2 kids with special needs, that's fully employed, and she does what she can. And if she can't, she can't. So, you know, that's her claiming that space. But then how does Kira fit in these understandings about what a victim or survivor is, and whose constructs are applying these ideas? And then we have institutional apparatuses such as courts, who also operate in ways that silence Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So this is Nadia Green, whose picture you saw at the front. This is her providing the victim impact statement to the New South Wales court. And she described it that it was a form of censorship, that she would write things and then her legal representation would forward it on to the DPP and the defence. And then they would say, yes or no, we can have that. No, we can't have that. And you can't put that in there. And this is how the stories are again censored. And the real impact of these stories aren't given voice. And so when I did the interviews with all the women, plus the families of murdered women, I made sure I provided them with the support, but I said, you start from wherever you want. And we went like that. And in that process, they were able to tell me what they wanted to tell me, not because they're giving a statement to the police or the DPP or through a victim statement. So these things are censored, they're narrated by systems, and the stories just don't get told. So this is the last slide because, like I said, I'm still thinking through this, and this is quite a heavy topic. And so I just wanted to reaffirm that womanhood is not synonymous. Indigenous women are not the same as white women. And I think, you know, Prof. Aileen's Morton Robinson's book told us that, and we've known that for a very long time. One thing is for sure, though, Indigenous women aren't seen, they're not considered or viewed in the same light as in non-Indigenous women, particularly when it comes to responses to violence. The social constructions of Indigenous women who experience violence remain fixated on this comparison with or against the non-Indigenous women. So those binaries, it's this constant, those sorts of things. And my last question there is who is worthy of protection, because that's what it comes down to when we see news reports of Aboriginal women and Torres Strait Islander women being murdered, and the system not supporting them. So that's the presentation.
Thank you very much for sharing such important work with us, Prof. Marlene. I cannot imagine, I should say I can appreciate what an incredibly challenging research project it is to work with a community of women who've been affected by and experienced such significant violence against them, compounded by the experience of not being heard by the institutions and actors in society that are meant to play a role in facilitating, if not protection and support, justice. I am going to throw to the rooms. I can't see everyone in Cairns, Prof. Marlene. But so I might send the first question out to the Zoom room where I can see everyone. But before I do that, I wonder if I might take Chair's prerogatives and ask the first question.
Yeah.
I was really struck by the frameworks that you had for comparing the ideal type victim to the culpable victim. And I can see immediately the types of colonial inscriptions upon Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and how that is jars against the ideal type. And I noted, you know, that the statistic around 90% of Aboriginal women know their perpetrators. And I was reflecting on, for non-Indigenous women as well, the likely perpetrators of violence against them are often men who are known to them. Maybe not, I don't know the exact statistic, but certainly a majority. And, you know, we have seen in recent years the emergence of organisations and national processes to address violence against women. And I imagine that's because many non-Indigenous women experience not being the ideal type victim either, and so are organising and creating mechanisms by which to insert themselves more agentically and strategically into these processes. And I know that you know this, but we know, because there's been national news about it, that Aboriginal women aren't being included in these efforts. So there's obviously a problem in the ideal type, and non-Indigenous women perhaps experience that as well. Why do you think it's been so difficult and hard for Aboriginal women to have a proper seat at the table of addressing violence against women and redressing, really, you know, the inaccuracy of what an ideal type victim is?
And I think it comes back to that binary of who is a woman, and what a woman should and shouldn't be. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are considered women by virtue of, you know, the gender and those sorts of things. But I think it's why we haven't been at the table is white women in particular have, and the feminists in particular, have taken a positionality that they speak for us because of our womanhood. There's different experiences with women, and I'm talking about the whole continuum of what a woman might be or who a woman might be. So it's and it's an assumption that these intersections are one and the same for Indigenous women and white women. And I think the work that's happening now to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, there is a standalone action plan that will be coming out in June, July next year. That's off the back of really strong advocacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And it's not that we've been included from the start and welcomed into these spaces. We've actually had to force our way into these situations where myself and a few other colleagues have had to actually write formal letters and speak with ministers and that sort of, just to get us a seat at the table. And then when you get the seat at the table, you have to be a certain type of activist. If you speak against the government, or you're seen to be voicing your agency in the way in which we do as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, if you don't conform to those white Western constructs, then again, you're excluded from conversations. So it comes back to that who's the good Aborigine, and those colonial divisions that can often, well, that has historically, separated our communities. So I'm pretty sure Indigenous people in this room on Zoom would actually have pictures of people coming in minds of those types of people. So this is that coloniality that we experience today, but it's also, I think it's that construct of who is an Indigenous woman, and that's not defined by us ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Prof. If I may, we do have a question in the Zoom chat from Manola at the IRC. And she asked, could you suggest how Indigenous women are supposed to articulate their domestic violence experiences to influence police to protect them when they can't protect themselves? So I know you interviewed a lot of women in your project. What sorts of things did women talk about in terms of how to get protection?
So part of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years and talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and families is that they can't access these services because of the microaggressions that they experience. So, and this is what I looked at in my in the PhD, was what were those experiences. So what was actually happening and what I could see across the data, Aboriginal women who were fair-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde hair received a better support than one of the darker-skinned, brown-haired, brown-eyed women. And I know it's only a small sample because I interviewed 14 for my PhD, but there was enough information across that sample to, as I reflected and as I remembered who I interviewed, the more darker-skinned women were less likely to be supported. However, the perception that Aboriginal women who can pass as a white woman, that's another angle again, because there was an Aboriginal woman that she had a very prominent position in the community. She was fair-skinned, and the minute she asked for the Aboriginal DVLO, the Domestic Violence Liaison Officer, the police would change. So when I talk about microaggressions, I'm talking about body language. And you're coming into a hostile environment, you're coming into an environment where an Aboriginal woman is, if she doesn't have bruises, if she doesn't have a broken arm, if she doesn't have a significant injury, it's difficult for the proof, although the coercive control laws are changing that now. So in terms of how we can help Aboriginal women and Torres Strait Islander women get access to the services is police have to change their ways of practice. Rather than saying to a woman, oh, you know, I've got to knock off soon, they really need to be able to be approachable. And it's those people on the front counter who, not necessarily the police DVLOs, it's actually the generalists who are the ones that can turn away Aboriginal women, and therefore she may die. And one of the women said that to me. So it's actually the way in which policing practice happens that needs to change.
Thanks, Prof. Marlene. Thank you very much. We are a few minutes past 2 p.m. and given our slightly delayed start, I just want to thank everyone for the generosity of your time this Friday. Many thanks to Prof. Marlene for presenting on her research in this area. The stakes are really high, and I know many of us in the room and in the community and in Far North Queensland feel it and, you know, have varied experiences and connection to this. So thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing it. It's not easy work to share. And thank you to everyone who's joined us to listen and to learn. We appreciate it, and keep in touch, and we'll let you know what we're doing in November in coming days.